Hello, and welcome to lesson 4.1, How Ions Affect Cells. So, since this is our first lesson of the second half of the semester, a reminder that in the previous slide, in the directions, I had you write down the lesson number title and the title. And these are the key ideas or the main things you need to know from this video. So, please make sure that in your notebook you have the title and these key ideas written down. Whoops. So in this video, one of the first things that we're going to talk about in Unit 4 is something called ions, right? And in this video, we're going to mainly talk about what ions are in general and how they function in our body. So something you should definitely have written down is the definition of ions. So when you think of ions, think about salts or electrolytes, right? The Gatorade you drink, or if you ever have a little sibling that's a toddler or younger, if they get sick, your doctor or nurse might recommend that they take some Pedialytes, and that also contains electrolytes or ions to help replenish their bodies, right? So all ions are elements like sodium, magnesium, chlorine, potassium, or calcium with an overall positive or a negative charge. So basically, these elements are slightly magnetic or they're charged in some ways. In future lessons, we'll talk more about what these ions look like and why they become this. But basically, know what the definition of an ion is, and know that these are some examples of ions in our body. To show that they are ions, we kind of put a plus sign if they have a positive charge and a minus sign if they have a negative charge. And we'll talk about what these numbers mean in future lessons, right? And in general, an ion is just a regular atom that either loses one of their electrons or more of their electrons, or they gain extra electrons, right? So if you want to kind of extend yourself a little bit, you can kind of guess what these numbers mean by looking at this sodium atom and how many electrons it has. And based off of how many it loses, why it has a charge of 1 plus, right? There's a 1 that should be here. It's 1 plus, not 1 minus when it loses an electron. And that has to do something with the charge of the electron. So you might be able to figure out, is it because of the charge of the electron, so on and so forth. But if not, it's okay. Just know that ions are elements with an overall positive or negative charge, meaning they have a plus charge or a minus charge. And these are some examples of ions in our body. So now let's talk about the 3 ways that ions affect our body cells, right? So we're going to talk about 3 different scenarios. And this first scenario, we're going to talk about what happens if we drink too much water and we don't have enough ions or salts, right? So basically, in a normal situation, you might want to think back to biology a little bit or 7th grade science class, that in a normal cell, if we have the appropriate amount of salts or ions in our body, what we have is something called an isotonic solution. You don't need to know this term. Basically, it just means that our cells are balanced or we are in something called homeostasis. You might remember that from your previous class, right? But if we drink too much pure water and not enough salts or ions, what basically happens is that if there's not enough salts or these red circles in the outside of our cell, our body will try to balance itself by adding more water inside the cell so that it becomes a little more like this, where things are even on both sides. Too much water on the outside because we drink too much water means we're going to our cells are going to absorb more water inside. So for us, basically what's going to happen is our cells are going to swell. And when they swell, they might go through something where it's going to get lysed or cytolysis, right? Cyto meaning cell, lysis meaning to break or split apart, right? So our cell is basically going to burst because we have too much water inside of our cells. So before our cells burst, we often feel this as symptoms of headaches, nausea, vomiting. Sometimes if you're doing a really hard workout, right, you've sweated out all of your salts and you drink too much water too fast, you might vomit out that water because your body's like, whoa, 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 slow down. We need some salts with this water in order to balance the sweat that you just sweated outside of your body. And when you sweat, if you've ever licked your sweat, it's kind of salty, right? And that's because you're losing those ions as well as the water outside of your body as well. So this paragraph pretty much just summarized what I went over. And this is what happens if you drink too much water and not enough ions or salts, right? So let's go through a second scenario, right? What happens if we drink too little water and consume too much salt, right? So usually this is like, I ate too many Takis and Flaming Hot Cheetos and all the junk food that's like delicious and savory. Too many ions, right? Too much salt. So in this scenario, this is our normal situation, right? Our cell is happy, it's balanced. There's an equivalent amount or ratio of salt to water inside and outside. On the other hand, in this column, notice that if we have too much salt, right, there's too much salt that we consume. So that salt stays in our bloodstream outside of our cells. And in order for our body to try to balance this out, it's going to try to push out the water inside of our cells, outside of our cells, right? So here, notice that there tends to be an equal amounts of water or the blue circles and salt, the red circles. But here, if there's way more red circles or salts, in order to balance both sides or maintain homeostasis, right, our body is going to push out the water inside of our cells outside. Right, so this will cause our cells to shrivel. A formal term for this is plasmalosis. Right. So symptoms that we would feel when this is happening inside of our body, things you probably already know: dehydration, fatigue. Your body might also go through frequent urination. So basically you have to pee a lot because your body is trying to get rid of some of these salts that are outside of your body, or ions that are outside of your body, right? The negative thing is that as you're peeing this stuff out, right, if your pee is often yellow, it's getting rid of those ions or those salts, but it's also getting rid of some water as well, right? And you might show signs of random swelling in different parts of your body or bloating, right? And that's because your cells are trying to push out the water outside of your bodies. And that's why you might notice some localized sweating, or not sweating, swelling. Okay, so now let's talk about the third way that ions affect our body. They affect our body through our brains. So if we could zoom into our brain cells, this is what our brain looks like at the molecular or cellular level, right? So this is one brain cell, super long, and you might see all these like lights flashing, and these lights represent an electrical signal. So every time you think, you talk, you move, an electrical signal is being sent from your brain in order for you to function and do that thing, right? So, how does this electrical function work? Well, it's dependent completely on ions or the salts inside your body, specifically sodium and potassium, right? Those are the two main salts that require your brain to function. I believe chlorine is also involved and very important. So basically, what happens right now, because you are alive, and every moment that you think, is that there's a difference between the outside of that cell. So this is also a neural cell or one of your brain cells, right? It's kind of like foofy here, and then there's this long line. And when your brain is at rest, all these positively charged ions are on the outside, and all these negatively charged ions are on the inside. But the moment you think or the moment you need to do something, right, the flow of these ions will switch from inside of the cell to the outside of the cell, right? And if we could zoom in here, right, here we have all the positive parts inside of the cell, or your sodium ions rushing in, and what rushes out are your chlorine ions, right? But in general, for this one, I just think it's kind of cool that your brain works like an electrical signal, right? Just know that ions are needed to send electrical signals in your brain cells. And without them, you would be dead, basically. You couldn't think, you couldn't function properly, you would not even be alive, you couldn't move, nothing would happen. So, in summary, know the definition of the ions and know the three ways that ions affect our cells. This is what an example of your notes could look like. And at this point, you should be ready to complete the practice questions on the next page.